All right, so we're going to get started. You got two handouts today. We will go over the assignment in far more depth in the coming lectures, but I like to at least throw it out there so you know what's coming. Important thing for you guys to know is it's not due until the 24th of October, so we've got a bit of time on this one. But I will go through it. We'll actually talk at length. I'll give you a bunch of examples so that it makes more sense, but I like to at least give it to you ahead of time. Today, we're going to switch yet again in the Adobe suite of products. We're going to switch from InDesign into Adobe Illustrator. Illustrator is remarkably similar to InDesign. In fact, a lot of the early layout work was done in Illustrator before Adobe created InDesign in the first place. So there's a lot of similarity, there's a lot of crossover, but there are some distinct advantages to working in Illustrator for certain things. And so my goal over the next week or two is to get you guys to understand what's really important about Illustrator and why those particular things are useful in Illustrator versus one of the other products. So today I thought for the first 15 minutes or so of lecture that I'd spend a little bit of time identifying the major difference between, say, Photoshop and Illustrator, and why we use one in one case and why we use one in another case. Because it's kind of a frequent question. Why do we go through all these different software programs? When am I supposed to use Illustrator? When am I supposed to use Photoshop? That sort of thing. So today we're going to talk first about vector and raster graphics in lecture format. Like I said, it's not going to be very long. I think I only have 12 or 15 slides, something like that for today's purposes. And then we'll spend a lot of time developing a specific skill in Illustrator, which is the pen tool. And some of you have already used the pen tool a little bit in either Photoshop or in InDesign to create some custom frames and whatever. Today we will spend a lot of time with the pen tool to get you familiar with the pen tool. It is kind of the one critical thing that you need to learn. And so as a result, we're going to spend a bulk of time working on it. The lecture that I'm giving today, I used to span over 2 class days. So you'd have 2 class days to work on it, but you guys know how the semester worked, where you get 2 weeks shorter and therefore every class is a little longer. So you get to do a little bit more work today because it's not spread over 2. So let's talk vector versus raster graphics. So first off, raster graphics, this is the world of Photoshop. Essentially, a raster graphic is made up of a bunch of individual colored squares called pixels. And so the more you zoom in on a particular image, at some level you get to the image where it's just a blurred set of pixels. If you have a really, really huge raster graphic that's just massive in its side, a gigapixel image, if you keep zooming in, eventually you'll get to the same place where there's little pixels of color. That's the essential makeup of a raster graphic. It's great if we're editing in raster graphics because we can do pixel by pixel edits. We can change one color just a little bit because it's made up of pixels. It's very easy to manipulate. It's really easy to do a clone stamp. Copy these pixels from here and make them the same over here. It's easy to do a grass brush. We did that in Photoshop. Copy these pixels from over here, make them look like grass over here. Because it's pixel by pixel, it's really easy to do. It's easier to edit anything where there's complex color. Any kind of a photograph, this is much easier to edit in a raster graphic program. It's also easier to apply fancy effects. There's a reason that Photoshop has the things like curves and levels and those kinds of adjustment layers in them because it's easy to apply those to this kind of a graphic, to a bunch of individual colored squares. The disadvantages of raster graphics, however, are that when you zoom in, at some level they're going to get blurry. They're going to become pixels. It's the nature of the beast. Raster file sizes are also very large. If you think about an image file, if it's made up of a bunch of little colored squares, the file has to contain the color information for every one of those million squares. So the file size inherently is much larger. The raster images also take more computer memory and or computing power to work with. So you'll find when we're working in InDesign or we're working in Illustrator that the computers are really snappy. At the end of the semester, when we do some of the more complex collages in Photoshop, you'll see that the file sizes get really big and the computers can become slow. You can even run out of space on the scratch disk, which does happen. And that's because these raster graphic files are really large. Vector graphics, on the other hand, are defined by math. Defined using a coordinate system, defined using mathematical equations. A square, for example, We have 4 corner points that make up a square. We actually technically would only need 2 corners if it was a coordinate system that identify what those corners are. And then the computer basically plays connect the dots. Here's my control points. Everything inside fill in one color. Everything outside is clear, for example. It's really easy. It's small memory format to do this sort of thing. So the advantage is you can scale any of these images without any distortion. You can make them as big as you possibly want. So you could have something that's really small that shows up on a business card, a logo, for example, and you could go print it on a billboard at full size, 20 feet wide, and it would be just as crisp because it's a vector graphic and it can scale up or down without losing any definition. File sizes are very small. Mathematical equation to define, not a bunch of individual pixels with colors, makes the file sizes really small. It's easier. I spelled that wrong. Happens, right? It's easier on the computer to manipulate the files. It's just some math. The file sizes aren't that big. Disadvantages. Vector images are not as good for photographs or high complexity color. On the right here, I have a sample of a vector graphic and a raster graphic. So this one here is vector. This one here is raster. And you can see, obviously, this looks like your traditional photograph. But do you see on this one how the regions are kind of blocky with certain colors? Because the raster or the vector graphic has to define this region is this color. It's math. This curve is this color. This other curve is this color, as opposed to pixel by pixel transitions of color. So for a photograph, the raster graphic is always far better than the vector graphic. So they're not as good for high complexity color, i.e. photographs, but they're also not as universal to work with. Generally, you have a JPEG, you can open it anywhere. It's a very universal file. Every computer can open a JPEG. If you have an EPS file or Adobe Illustrator file, you're going to be stuck into one of the special programs that are going to open it. If you have an AutoCAD file, which is also, by the way, a vector graphic program, you have to have AutoCAD to open it. So it's kind of a specialty thing. Not quite so universal. So when do we use raster versus vector? So raster images, photographs, high dynamic range images, HDRI background images for rendering, those are all in the raster category. Vector is line drawings, which would include architectural drawings, product design drawings, those kinds of things, logos, fonts. Obviously, a font you want to be able to scale up as big as you want. You want to be able to change that, so that would fall into that category. So those are all vectors. Rasters are photographs. So let's look at some examples. So I think this is a pretty good side. So they're looking in this example here at this logo, and they're saying, OK, these are different resolutions. So at a small resolution, 250 by 78, the vector size is 36 kilobytes, which is really small. The bitmap size is bigger, but it's still pretty small at 57 kilobytes. We up the size of that graphic, 800 by 248. The vector size doesn't change. It's mathematically derived, so it's the same size no matter what size it is in terms of file size. Look at how much bigger the bitmap size gets. 10 times bigger, just because it blew up. Then we get to this size, for example. We're still at 36, and we get over 2 megabytes in size. So the file sizes do really matter as we get into those upper resolutions. Here's another example here that it shows the fact that raster images get blurry as you zoom in. So we have the 100% scale one on the left. We have the vector graphic blown up to 1600% on the little tip of the wing, and you can see that it's all nice and sharp still. And then the same image, if it was a JPEG and it was blown up, it's called rasterizing the image, to 1600%, you get those pixels. So there's a distinct difference when you're scaling up an image. So some examples of raster programs: Photoshop. GIMP is the open source version of Photoshop. V-Ray is another example of a raster image file. Vector files, Illustrator, InDesign, those are the ones we're working with right now. But AutoCAD, Vectorworks, Revit, Rhino, all of the drawing programs that we have a tendency to use are all in the vector category. I mean, you could extend that. It could be SolidWorks. It could be Fusion. It could be any of those, because they're all mathematically derived. There's a reason that in AutoCAD we draw full scale and then scale it down later, because size doesn't matter. Okay, so that's the fundamental difference between raster and vector graphics. I'm going to switch over. Like I said, this first little bit was short. I'm going to switch over to the school computer, and we'll go through Illustrator. I want to teach you guys the pen tool to get started. So while I'm switching over, if you wouldn't mind logging into the course website if you haven't done so already. And there's a download under today's exercise for you guys to get started. It's a template. And so I'll go ahead and show you that once I switch over as well. But you guys can get started finding that. OK, so I have exercise 113 pulled up here. And in exercise 113, if we scroll down a bit, down to the bottom, I have download Illustrator Template for exercise 113. This is to get you started. You could create your own template. We're going to use a website, or optionally, you could use a website called calligrapher.com. But I've already downloaded the Illustrator template for you, so you don't have to sign in and sign up for it. So once this is downloaded, I can go ahead and click on it to open it up. And it's going to open up in Adobe Illustrator. There we go. So in Adobe Illustrator, I want to point out some things that are going on and kind of the basic setup of Illustrator, just so that you're aware. It looks an awful lot like InDesign. So the setup is very, very similar to InDesign. That shouldn't be a big surprise because it's built by Adobe, same company. But there's a few things that are a little bit different. I'm going to, for today's purposes, let me go back to, interesting. So Adobe loves to move things around when they update. I'm used to working in Essentials Classic myself because it has the ribbon at the top of the page. It appears that Illustrator feels the need to remove that. Such is life. Let me double check here. Yeah, some of these they have. Anyway, I'm going to work in Essentials Classic for right now. I think that'll work a little bit better in my workspace. And so as I go over, just like all the rest of the software programs, I want to kind of walk you through what's happening in these various software programs. We have our typical file structure at the top of the page, where there's a lot of commands hidden. Object and type are two primary ones that you're going to work with. Select is also a menu item that we'll get to a little bit later on in class. Down the left side of the page here are our standard tools that we've been working with, most of which look similar to the InDesign tools, though you'll see a distinct lack of the frame tool. That's not here. That's a layout tool that's distinct and so special for InDesign. But there are some things that are similar, like the black arrow and the white arrow. So we have the regular selection tool, and we also have the direct selection tool, the white arrow. We're going to use that extensively today. As we come down a little bit further, there is a pen tool. That's the other thing that we're going to use a lot of today. It looks like an old-fashioned ink pen icon or so. If we come down here a little bit further, about halfway down, there's something called the width tool. It looks kind of like a banana slug, for lack of some better way of describing it. We'll talk about that a little bit later today as well. If you keep coming down all the way toward the bottom, we have two other things here. We have a fill color and a stroke color. So this fill color is the color inside of a shape that we draw. The stroke color is the outline color of a shape. So in my case here, by default, the outline color is black. The fill color is white. I'd prefer that the fill color be transparent for what I'm going to be working with. So making sure that that is clicked, I'll click the little red slash underneath it to make that fill color transparent. And I'm doing that before I even start drawing anything right now. If I switch over to the other side of the page here, we have our basic properties up right now, but we also have a whole series of tools running down. These are windows that will open running down the right side of the page here, some of which we'll use today. The first one that I want you to click on is almost toward the bottom. It's two diamonds stacked on top of each other. That's your layers palette. And under layers, there are a bunch of layers that are turned on. I want you to turn off pages 2. So click the little I next to pages 2, and that will get us to the start of the regular letters. So page 2 is off. I also want to make sure that page 1 right here is highlighted in light blue. So I've turned off page 2, and I've highlighted font page 1 in light blue. That's going to be my active layer. That's the one I'm going to be drawing on. When I'm done with that, I'll go ahead and click the double arrow pointing to the right to minimize that. So once again, page 2 I've turned off by clicking on the eyeball. Page 1 here, I've made the active layer by just clicking on it. And now I can start to draw. Some of you won't have done this, and when you start to draw, it won't actually let you draw. It'll give us that symbol, the pen with the little red slash through it, or the line, the circle with the slash through it. That's because you're not on the page 1 layer. At that point, I'll be able to draw as long as I'm on that page 1 layer. OK, so now it's a matter of talking through how the pen tool works. And the pen tool is not something that I'm arbitrarily just picking on you and making you learn. It's actually something that I believe is very, very useful to get comfortable with. The other thing about the pen tool, though, is it takes a lot of practice to get good with the pen tool. And so you guys just need some practice. And the more you practice, the better you'll be at it. So we're going to start practicing with the pen tool. Down here, I'm going to select the pen tool. I'm going to start with the first letter A here. It's pretty reasonable. I'm going to use Control plus to zoom in. Oops, sorry, I have to actually pick the pen tool. There we go. Control plus to zoom in. I'm going to hold down spacebar so that I can move my page around. And now I'm looking right at the letter A here. This will be my first letter to draw. We could start on a different letter. It doesn't matter, but it's the first letter, so I'll go ahead and start on it. And when I go to start drawing this, I've given myself some guides here. This is part of the template that I've downloaded for you, so you know what's happening. The cap height is this line up here. The X height is right there. The baseline is right there. And the maximum descender is down here. So if I'm drawing a capital A, I would start at the baseline. And I'm just going to make a single click right there at the baseline. I'm going to come up to the cap height right there at the angle that I want. Right there. Then I'll come down back to the baseline. And the nice thing about Illustrator is it does snap for us. So we're snapping right on the baseline to right like that. When I'm done, I'll go ahead and click the black arrow like that. So this particular line is pretty thin, so I may need to make it a little bit thicker. When I click on that line over here in the Properties window, I have stroke and I have a thickness. I can increase that thickness a bit. I'll do it at 5. I'll do it at maybe 6 so that you guys can see it, maybe even a little bit more. There we go. We'll do it at 8 so you can see it a little bit better. So I did that first A, but if you notice, the center point here isn't quite in the center of the two legs. That's a little bit of a problem. So I need to make some edits to this particular shape. And I can do that using the white arrow, the Direct Select tool. What the Direct Select tool allows us to do is to select individual control points on any curve. So I can click on the white arrow, the Direct Select tool. I can come down here, and I can click and select just this anchor. And I can move that anchor over until it's in the center. If you're having trouble getting it the way you want it, you can also use the arrow keys on the keyboard, which can be a useful way of manipulating your particular shape. I'm just holding down the arrow keys, and you can see that move. Like that. So now I have that part of the A drawn. It's time to come back to the pen tool. And when I go to draw the cross, this is something that's important that gets people lost sometimes. I'm zooming in a little bit so you can see this better here. If I move my pen tool over the top of an existing path, see how I get a little plus sign? That's going to add a control point to this path, not give me a new line. So I actually want to make sure that I'm not quite on top of my old line and I start right next to it. I'll click, and then when I come over to this side, I can snap right to the line itself, like that. Then this will take, I'll go back to the selection tool, followed by the direct selection tool, so that I can move this anchor point over like that. And that's creating the first bit of my letter there. Don't worry, I'm going to repeat this many times as we go through letters. So that then gives me the A. And we'll come back and explore some more options relating to the A a little bit later. I'm going to move on to the B. Actually, let me do an H since I'm right here. Like I said, we don't have to do these in order. So the H is pretty simple. I'll use my pen tool. We'll start right up here at the top at the cap height. I'll come straight down to the baseline. And there's the first part of the H. I'll go to the direct select, or excuse me, the selection tool. And I'll come back to my pen tool. This, by the way, is very slow when I'm talking through it because I'm coming up here and clicking. There are keyboard shortcuts to do this. So I could just press V, and then I could go back and press P to get back to the pen tool. So I don't have to go back and click the button. I'm clicking the button so that you guys can see what I'm doing as opposed to doing keyboard actions. So I'll come over here, and I'm going to draw the second line coming down for the H. Right there. If I'm having trouble getting it straight, I can always hold down the Shift key, which will make it straight. And there's that. I'll come back to the regular selection tool. I'll come back to the pen tool. And then I need to draw my crossbar on the H. So stylistically, I can put it wherever I want as I start to develop this font. Remember, I don't want to be on top of the path itself. I want to be slightly over from it. We'll go straight across. And there it is. I'll go to my direct select, select that endpoint, and move it over just a bit. Now, if I decided I didn't like the placement of that crossbar, I could come back to the regular selection tool. I could select it, and I could move it to a different level if I wanted to. So that was the H. Let me do the F. Once again, I'll use my pen tool. And we'll start here at the top. And I'll come straight down to make the F there. I'll go back to my selection tool, back to my pen tool. Now this time, I'd like the top of my F to connect to this particular point. I can do that as I move my pen tool over the top of that point. You see that it gives me a little slash next to the pen tool, that little diagonal line. That means it's going to connect to that anchor point. So I'll connect to that anchor point and keep going over for the top of the F, like that. I'll go back to my selection tool, back to my pen tool, and I'll come over here and draw the next part of my F, like that. Back to the selection tool, and maybe that needs to move down just a little bit, like that. E, pretty easy. Now, I've already drawn this part of the F. It wouldn't be a bad strategy to just use the same thing. So I'll use my selection tool right here, and I'll select the F. I'll go to Edit, Copy, and then Edit, Paste. And we'll move it over so it's in the E section. And now all I need to do is draw the bottom. So once again, I'll connect to right here. And I'll come over and draw the bottom of the E like that. So there's nothing wrong with repeating certain letters that are similar. So the E and the F are similar. No reason not to copy and paste. OK, so let's look at the D now. So the D is a little bit more complicated. Suddenly we have some curve. And we have to be able to draw that curve. Could I do a D that looked like this, where I went straight down? Sure, I could have a D that looked like that. But I'd like you guys to practice with the curve. So let me back up here. I'll start there. I'll come straight down to that point. I'm going to come out a little bit so that I have a flat bottom on the D to right about there. Then I'm going to pick a point that's about halfway, which once again, Illustrator is giving me some guides, so I know approximately where halfway is. And instead of clicking with a single click, I'm going to click and hold with the mouse. And when I do that, as I drag out, I'll get a tangent line for this curve. So it's a click, hold, drag. And that's going to allow me to adjust for this curvature. So in this case, it's a really long curve, so I've made my handles really long. We're going all the way up there. And it's now made that part of the curve. Now I'm going to come back over to the top here. So it's about there. And that time I didn't click and hold. It was just a single click. And then we'll come over until I match the corner. So I made that look really easy. It's not. I promise you it's not. It takes time to do it. So do it several times. Get some practice in. We're going to do more letters that are like this. So I'm going to repeat this one again. Once again, it doesn't matter. I could start at the bottom and go up toward the top. It doesn't make any difference. Let me do it from the top down again. There. We'll go straight down. I could hold down Shift if I'm struggling to get it straight. There it is. I'll come over a little bit to get that. I'll move to the halfway point, which is right about there. I'm going to click, hold, and drag the tangent line. There we go. I'll finish my arc to right there. And then I'll come over and connect to the other part. So let's move over and let's go to the B. Okay? Another more complicated letter. So we'll start here, and I'm going to start with the vertical line. I'll go straight down, and there's my vertical line. I'm going to go back up to the top. So I'm going to go back to my pen tool, and I'm going to start right here. I'm going to go over just a little bit. And now I'm not going to come to the halfway point because this is a smaller part of the letter. I'm going to go to about halfway in between those two lines. Say right about there. Click, hold, drag to create that part of it. We'll come down here to create that part. Then I'll go ahead and come straight over like that. I'll go back to my selection tool. I'll come back to my pen tool. I'll start at the bottom now. We'll go over a little bit further, about halfway up. Click, hold, drag. Give myself those guides. Come back over like that. And then we'll come to those meet. So it's OK, but it's not the best B in the world. So this takes some manipulation afterward. So I'm going to go back to the direct selection tool, that white arrow, and I'm going to start to adjust things. So first off, the end of this really needs to come up and match up with the end right there. Next thing is this loop isn't quite straight. So it probably needs to go up a little bit, maybe like that. I can also adjust the curvature down using these tangent lines. I could take this point and pull it back further, like that. Maybe pull this whole thing back a little bit further. Maybe pull this back a little bit. Pull this down a little bit. I can also adjust the curvature here if I wanted to, using these tangent lines. So that's better. It's still a little lumpy. Let me pull this tangent down just a little bit. Pull that tangent up just a little bit. And maybe out. Yeah, so it takes some extra manipulation to get it right as you make your adjustments. I might also need to adjust this curve here. So there's that tangent line. This one needs to go down just a little bit. Maybe that was too far. So once again, this is all direct selection tool. There we go. And that looks reasonable for my letter B. So these ones take time. Now when we get to the C, you can see that I'm going kind of out of order because I'm picking the easy ones first, and we're getting harder. So on a C, this is much harder. So I'd start, say, about here. I'd have to come up to about where I think the top would be. I'll click, hold, drag to create the top of the C. I'll come down about halfway, click, hold, drag to make that part of the C. Come down to the very bottom, click, hold, drag to make that part of the C, and then we'll come back up to right there. Now, that wasn't too bad. That was a reasonable C. But that comes from years and years of practice being able to do it. The truth is that something like this can be very, very complicated to try to create from scratch. We haven't gotten to the S yet. That's the most challenging of all of them. But you can use shapes rather than just creating the curve from scratch. So if the C is presenting a bit of a challenge, come over here to the shapes. Underneath the rectangle tool is an ellipse tool. Using the ellipse tool, I can draw the base for the C. So we'll say something like that. It's a nice, perfect, smooth circle. Obviously, you could do this for an O too, or a Q. And now I want to modify this particular shape a little bit. And so I'll do that, again using the pen tool, but this time hidden underneath the pen tool, I'm going to use some specific commands. Below the pen tool is the Add Anchor Point tool. I'm going to use that one. This Add Anchor Point tool will allow me to add a point where I think the top and the bottom of the C should be. So I'll say maybe right about there, and I'll add one more point right about there, which is where I think the bottom should be. So I've added 2 extra control points, there and there, or Illustrator calls them anchor points. I apologize. Rhino calls them control points, so in my brain I'm really used to calling them control points. But Illustrator calls them anchor points. So now that I have this point and this point established, I can use the Direct Select tool right here, the white arrow, and I'm going to pick this one point that's in the middle of these 2 points. When I pick that point and I press the Delete key, the 2 line segments that are attached to that point are going to delete. So I have that point selected. I'll go ahead and press the Delete key, and now those 2 sections of line segments go away, and I'm left with just the C, which is a nice, perfectly round C. Let's move over to the G, because it's very similar. So here, I'll start again with the ellipse tool, and I'll drag the ellipse like that. Now I'm going to add my anchor point again. So there's my Add Anchor Point tool. There's the top of the G, right there. And I want to point maybe right about here where the G is going to come over. So we'll say right about there. Once again, I'll go back to the Direct Select tool. And I'll select the point in the middle. There it is. And I'll go ahead and press the Delete key, like that. If there was not a point in the middle, so let's say that in this scenario, I actually wanted the G to be halfway up. There's already a point there. I don't need to add that anchor point. If I came up and added an anchor point here for where the break needed to happen, I have no point in between this anchor point and this anchor point to select to be able to get rid of that line segment. So I actually needed to add one more segment. So I'll put one in the middle there. Doesn't matter where. Then I can press Delete and get rid of those 2 line segments. So in order to delete a line segment out of one of these circles or one of these shapes, you have to have 2 control points at either end of the line segment that you want to get rid of, and one in the middle to be able to select and press the Delete key. So at this point, I can go back to my pen tool. I can start right here, and I can pull over my G like that. So let's see. We've done H. We'll move down into the next set of letters here. I, J, yeah, the rest of those. OK, let's get into the hard ones. So S is really hard. This is the most challenging one. I would save this one till the very end for you. So when you do that, it's once again going to be the pen tool. This one, I think the thing that happens to people too frequently on an S is you pick too many control points. So you start to say, OK, here's my first point. OK, I'm going to put one point right there, and I'm going to put another point right here, and I'm going to put another point right here, and another one there, and another one there. Okay, and it doesn't look too bad, but you see how it's kind of lumpy? Fewer points is better on these kinds of curves. So let me go back to my pen tool. I'll have to have a point where I start. There's the point where I start. I'll put one up here at the top and control it with my guide. I'll put one point right about here to control the second part of the S, like that. I'll come over and control the third part of the S right about there. Fourth part would be right about there. And the last one will be over here. Now, I know it doesn't look as good. The other one actually looked better to start. But with these points, when I come back and start to make my manipulations, I can correct them very, very nicely using these handles. So give me a little bit of time. Oops. So the advantage of using these fewer control points is that you have a much smoother curve in between the two lines. And I should also point out that when you're adjusting one of these handles, the length of the tangent line affects the curve as well. So on a lot of these, as I'm working through them, I'm adjusting the lengths of the tangent lines. This needs to go up a little bit higher like that. This needs to get a little bit shorter. And I'm getting there in terms of identifying this S. But it's a nice smooth curve versus the one that was a lot more chunky. And so this one just gets a little bit off there, about like that. So I would spend a little bit more time getting the S right. But the idea here is that fewer curves is better. Now, the other option for creating the S that some people elect to do, I'm going to move this one over for a second and show you, is sometimes people like to do an S that's generated this way. So there's the top of my S. There's the bottom of my S. It may take some manipulations here to get those two to match up. So this is kind of like an 8. I'll come in here with my Add Anchor Point tool. I'll get rid of that point. And then I'll select, using Direct Select, this point right here to get rid of that part of the line segment. Same thing, I'll go to right there for the end of the S. I'll use my Direct Select to select that point and delete it. And so I've created the S that way, which is certainly a doable option. The problem here is that these are still these are still two distinct pieces. So when that happens, I need to actually join the two together. And so in order to do that, and I'm going to exaggerate this a bit so that there's a gap in between them so you can see what happens. I have two anchor points. I have an anchor point there, and I have an anchor point there. If I use my Direct Select, my white arrow, and I select both of those anchor points, so those two are selected, none of the other ones are selected, I can come up here, and in the ribbon at the top of the page here, I can select the Connect Selected Anchor Points together. By the way, if you're in the regular Essentials mode, I'm used to the Classic mode. It's in the Properties over here on the right. So what they've done is they've moved the bar across the top, the ribbon to the right side here under Properties. So just be aware that it's there if you're in the regular Essentials mode. When I click on that Connect the Selected Endpoints, it's going to connect them together. And obviously, I exaggerated it. I pulled them apart further so that they become one connected piece. If I backed myself up to where these two were together like this, I'd select them both, even though they're very, very close together. See, there they are. They're really close together. And I can say Connect Selected Endpoints. Now they're connected together. I can go into Control minus to zoom out. And now I have a really nice S. I may decide that this still needs some edits. So I might pick that control point, and I might move that over to make it not quite so long. Likewise, I could move this one over as I start to make those adjustments. I just use the keyboard shortcuts to do that adjustment. Okay, so that was the S. The S is by far the hardest. Start with the straight line segments first. You'll get the most out of those for practice. Get used to the pen tool as you move forward. So I've done that with these letters. Let's assume for the moment that I've gone through and done the rest of the letters right now. I also have some options for how I control the style of these letters. So let's look at the first one that I did. Let's look at the letter A. So there's the letter A. I have options for how the endpoints of this A are dealt with. So let me go ahead and use my Direct Select tool, the white arrow, and let me select this point here in the center. When I select that point there in the center, I can come over to my, and this is again in the Essentials Classic mode, I can come over here to my stroke, and this is where I could change the stroke value. This, by default, is not all of my options, however. So if I click the little flyout menu, this 4-bar thing, and I show options, I get a lot more options. And this is what I was looking for. First thing here is I've got cap and corner. These are corner options. So this is a corner. Right now it's a sharp corner, but I could round the corner. See how the corner becomes rounded instead of becoming sharp? I could also do a bevel on the top, so it's cut off and is straight on the top. The lower corners down here, if I were to select them, I can deal with the cap. I could make it rounded if I wanted to. I could make it extend, or I can make it trim at the same level. The other thing that people tend to ask is, well, what happens if I really wanted my shape to end exactly at the bottom line? Okay? There's no convenient way of doing that. The best strategy for that, because we're using only strokes here, would be to draw it like this, where it extends past the line, and then give yourself a rectangle that is white. Oops, sorry. Let me draw the rectangle first. Like that. I'm going to flip that so it's filled, and I'm going to change my fill color to be white. And that will cut it off at the bottom. It's not the ideal way of doing it, but the way that they generate the fonts using this website, it will work. In reality, if you were designing a font, and I'm not asking you to do this, in reality, you would actually draw the font as a complete outline of the font. So if I were drawing the A, for example, if I was really designing a font, I would draw the A starting, say, here. I would come up, go over, and then, sorry, I should be doing this in a color so you can see it. I'm not asking you to do this, I'm just showing it to you. I would make my A that way, where I had individual control over all sides. So it's a little bit different as a strategy, but it's a lot more work, and you need to be a lot more comfortable with the pen tool, which is why I'm not asking you to do it. But it gives you flexibility to be able to do things like that, where you can adjust the actual letter a little bit more. So I'm just pointing that out as the full strategy, which is why things like, sorry, get rid of a few more things here. It's why you have trouble with the endpoints, because we're just using our basic strokes with a single line thickness. OK, so we can change what the ends look like. That's one thing. The other thing that we can do is we could change one of the stroke thicknesses versus the other. So I've got these two vertical bars. I'm going to take my horizontal bar, and I could say, you know what, I just want that to be thicker. And I could thicken that up. And that would be stylistically different. If, however, I wanted to adjust the thickness as it went along the curve, I can use something over here called the width tool. It's about halfway down in your toolbar. This is the one that looks like a banana slug. If you click on that and you move over the course of your shape, at any point along your shape, you can click and drag and adjust the width at that particular point. So I could say that, you know what, at this point I want the width to be there. And over here I want the width to go down to be very narrow. And right here I want this width to be a little bit narrower too, like that. This corner needs to be a little bit narrower, maybe like that, etc. So I can get creative about what's happening with the width. This width is also shown as a profile. So if I came back to, let me find another one here. Let's do the D. Down here in my stroke menu at the very bottom, it says Profile. I can pick one of the preset profiles. So I could say that I wanted it to taper at the ends. I wanted it to get fat in the middle. I wanted it to have both. And you can play around with these are presets. That doesn't mean that these are the only way. We create our own when we use the width tool. But I want to point out that those are there as well. So the one other thing that is available to you are brushes. I'm not going to go extensively into brushes. For those of you that feel comfortable and want to use brushes, you can. We will spend a whole lecture talking about brushes when we do diagrams. And at that point, I'll introduce a bunch of the concepts of brushes. So for today's purposes, I think stay within the stroke menu, work on just the width and the width tool, or the thickness of the stroke. Get through the practice of all the letters. If you finish the first page, which has most of the capital letters and the numbers, remember you can go back to your layers. You can turn off page 1 and page 1, turn on page 2 and page 2, and start working on page 2. This has the rest of the capital letters and the lowercase letters. So there is plenty for you to do. My goal for you today is to work the remainder of the time in class. So I expect you to just keep working, because practice, like I said, is the most important thing for you when it comes to getting comfortable with this. So the goal is to try to get through all the letters if we can. When you're done, you're going to go up to File, and you're going to go to Export, and you're going to say Export As. And we don't want it to go to AutoCAD. We're going to go to a JPEG, and you're going to export it as a JPEG. You can then post this on the course website for your exercise 113. If you did finish all of the letters and you want to actually make it a font, on the back of your exercise, I do have the instructions for how you can send it to this website, and they'll make it a real font that you can work with. But again, that part's optional today, so I'm not going to spend my time showing you how to do that part. It doesn't really matter if it actually creates the font. The point is to practice with the pen tool. That's the critical part of what we're doing. Okay? Hopefully there aren't any questions just yet, but I'll turn you guys loose so you guys start working on this. If you run into a snag or something's not working right, I'll come around and help you at that point.